I'm so excited for our last, but certainly not least, panel of our conference, which has happened over the last 3 Fridays. I'm also sad that the conference is almost over. These 3 Fridays have really given me so much to think about and so much to ponder as I think about both my own advocacy work and the work of so many other people and working in different aspects of the immigrants' rights world. The panel we have now brings together several extremely important players working at the cutting edge of a number of important immigration issues, including what sometimes feels like the elephant in the room, the legal status of 11 million undocumented people. So to guide us in this conversation, we're very fortunate to have Chris Newman moderating this panel. Chris is the legal director and general counsel for the National Day Labor Organizing Network. From that position, at the intersection of law and organizing, Chris has played a critical role in several of the most significant immigrants' rights movements of the last 20 years, including the campaign against Sheriff Arpaio, Sheriff Joe in Arizona, Maricopa County, the Not One More campaign to stop all deportations under the Obama administration, various different iterations of advocacy efforts on state and local entanglement and immigration enforcement, including in California here against secure communities, and then what eventually would lead to the California Trust Act, the California Truth Act, the California Values Acts. And then finally, over the last 4 years, Chris has been heavily involved in the movement for the National TPS Alliance and for justice for TPS holders in this country. Chris also teaches here at UCLA in the Institute for Research on Labor and Employment, and along with his boss/partner in crime, Pablo Alvarado, Chris has helped make Endelon one of the most effective and powerful actors in the immigrants' rights movement. I should add that Chris and I talk about immigrants' rights issues a lot, not only because we are neighbors and have children around the same age, but also because I find him to be one of the keenest observers of the landscape in which I work. So we're very lucky to have Chris leading this discussion. One last thing I should say before I turn it over to him. Chris had the interesting idea of using Twitter as an alternate forum for posting questions for this event. So we're going to try that here. If you want to post a question, you can use the Q&A, just like we've done for the last 3 days of the conference, but you can also post it to Twitter with the hashtag CILP100. And we will monitor both of those channels as the conversation begins. Chris, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Ahilan. This is a little bit of an unfamiliar role for me. I'm not usually the public face for Endelon. And usually actually when we do things at Endelon, if we do a public event, we say something's gone wrong in the planning if I'm the one talking. So I don't know what that means about the planning of this conference. I am used to sharing my views without filter on Twitter and sort of shouting into the void on Twitter. So that part will be familiar. And I'm happy to be here. I'm so proud to work at Endelon, a network of over 50 day labor worker centers that are labor sanctuaries all across the country, where immigrants can seek and receive work and have access to rights and power building opportunities without inquiry into their immigration status. As you point out, our member organizations have formed the building blocks of a lot of important work across the country, and I feel really privileged to represent them and that work in the setting. I'm also proud to teach at the Labor Studies Department. I just taught a class on DACA, trying to identify and solve the mystery why so few people know how DACA came to be, specifically with respect to the brilliant bottom-up activism of young immigrant civil rights leaders and the top-down decision calculus of the Obama administration, which to this day remains a guarded secret, even as we're trying to figure out how to influence his former vice president. And so I'm wearing both hats, and I just want to say how grateful I am to be invited by 2 of my professional heroes, you two. And I want to extend thanks and congrats for your auspicious launch to this ambitious law school project, the new center. I was actually part of the ad hoc group of immigrant rights lawyers who formed a kind of informal recruiting committee to invite Hiroshi to Los Angeles, actually. It was a little bit like a kind of World Cup level Olympic effort to recruit Hiroshi here at the time. And we knew him to be a brilliant scholar and author of books that we'd all learned from, but we didn't know the extent to which he would nurture the community when he got here. And this center is really an extension of his approach to teaching and learning and engaging and synthesizing tough stuff like only he does. And of course, Ahilan is known as, the best, rightfully, I think, among the best civil rights litigators in the country, a MacArthur ordained genius He's also known in the TPS Alliance as, at any given point, a better attorney than the best attorneys that Trump could throw at him. But it's also been really cool to see him grow into this role at the center, supporting organizing, advocacy, making connections, and being an educator at the same time. And if this conference is an indication, Hiroshi and Ahilan are going to do really big things at a time when big things need to be done. And they're going to bring some West Coast to East Coast energy, which I think can't hurt at this moment, particularly when we think about how West to East migration has been a hedge over the years against East to West settler colonial migration in this country in the past, even in the present. Just ask anyone from Arizona. I've always been struck myself that conferences on immigrant rights and about strategy are often highly exclusive spaces where people ironically talk about the need for inclusivity. This, I think, conference has really been unique in setting a new path, and I think taking advantage of this kind of infinitely surreal Zoom connected pandemic world. This conference has actually been a successful experiment in being an inclusive space about inclusivity, bringing together thinkers and actors in strategic dialogue and creating a kind of public classroom that breaks down barriers to participation. And it's been really cool. People talk about how law schools are Socratic learning institutions, but this conference, I think, has really been Freirean, both in describing events and also shaping events at the same time, and helping unlock the potential for people who are experiencing the unjust status quo to be themselves agents of change, and it's been really uplifting. I will say that in this spirit, in the Freirean spirit, the one area of disappointment in the conference has been the lack of Central American and Indigenous voices in the Zoom boxes, particularly at this point when the negation of Central American Indigenous voices, excuse me, is so central to how bad our politics and discourse have become. I feel comfortable saying this because, I think as Freire has called upon us to sort of not replicate systems of domination that we're seeking to change. I know that this point of criticism will be accepted in the spirit in which it's offered. And speaking of uncomfortable practice, I actually thought that uncomfortable practice was most on display during Ahilan's riveting conversation with Secretary Mayorkas, which served as an incredible point of connection for people experiencing their own oppression and their oppressor, which I think Secretary Mayorkas frankly personifies as the principal enforcer of unjust and racist laws. He even acknowledged, I think, his almost sovereign levels of power to determine who stays, who goes, who gets to come back, and who's been wrongfully deported. And Ahilan and Secretary Mayorkas allowed their conversation to be a point of connection that even brought in people who were doing civil disobedience that day, people who've been wrongfully deported trying to get back, and immigrant civil rights leaders in California. And so when we talk about some of the law and organizing issues, when we think about the outside and inside game, that really was a great moment, even if it was surreal. And it was surreal to see Mayorkas praising the ACLU yesterday on MSNBC. And that's something we thought, at least I thought we'd see as the Secretary of Homeland Security praising the ACLU on MSNBC. I'll speak for myself just initially. I think I'm going to spend the next 4 years being very critical of Secretary Mayorkas. But I want to take this opportunity to praise him as others have for coming and engaging so transparently, despite some of his familiar fear-mongering, which was really regrettable and unacceptable, frankly. But I will point out that the conversation was in real stark contrast to Secretary Napolitano's first engagement with stakeholders, which happened in 2009. I remember it vividly. At the Center for American Progress, when she gave a speech about secure communities, outlining secure communities as a core strategy for the Obama administration, a strategy and a policy which became a really terrible stain on the Obama administration and caused a lot of unnecessary harm to people and disruption of law and politics. And by the way, like Secretary Mayorkas in his conversation, Secretary Napolitano then had her own coming down the escalator moment in that speech, creating a moral panic, criminalizing immigrants, using examples that were sensationalized to justify unjustifiable policies. And that actually became a precursor, if we're being honest, to what then happened the following year in her home state of Arizona with SB 1070. And that policy, Secure Communities, in fact, enabled SB 1070, despite protestations to the contrary from the Obama administration at the time. Anyhow, Secretary Mayorkas said that we're going to have a tough hill to climb to convince him on this stuff. And there are plenty of people on this Zoom, I think, who are going to help him climb that hill. And hopefully he'll be open with the spirit of transparency that he had. Anyhow, the conversation between Ahilan and Mayorkas also set a precedent in a different way as well. I think, and that's in the sense that comprehensive immigration reform didn't come up once, I don't think, during the conversation. And so I'll start us talking about that as we turn the conversation to the actual topic at hand on the interplay of branches of government when we think about what to do. Our panel was tasked with having this conversation, essentially. Given that Congress is in shambles, that it's a broken institution, and that's being generous, with a Republican Party that is disintegrating and hanging together only by the thread of immigrant scapegoating, given that President Biden himself has been less bold than we had hoped him to be, given the hostility of the courts right now, what is the immigrant rights movement to do at this moment when everyone talks about the need to hit a reset button after Trump? Reset to what? Where? With whom? How? These are big questions we're not going to be able to answer just to set expectations, which is so important. But one thing's for sure, we're not going to revert to the 20-year-old strategy, fully 20-year strategy of pursuing a single bill as a panacea to all of our problems. We're beyond that, thankfully, I think, as a collective movement. And in fact, I think, arguably, pursuing comprehensive immigration reform as a panacea or allowing it to be proffered by politicians as such might have been part of the story of how we got here, putting off hard conversations that hopefully we're going to have. My read of American history, for what it's worth, and Hiroshi can definitely zoom in. I'd hope to attract him on Twitter if I'm wrong. But at any given point in American history, there's three big factors governing immigration law. Number one are the laws on the books written by Congress. The second are statutes. The second is exercise of discretion by the executive branch and kind of courts acting as a limit on that. And then the third part is always the sort of terms of the national debate, or what people now talk about as the Overton window. What are we imagining is even possible as a range of policy options? Abolishing ICE, legalizing 11 million people, building walls up, tearing walls down, driver's licenses, kicking ICE out of prisons and jails. And I think it's important for us to ask whether the pursuit of comprehensive immigration reform, despite having been launched with good intentions, not only failed to win, but also made things worse. But regardless of what you think of my opinion, I think it's fair, regardless of what you think about my opinion, which might be controversial, I think it's fair to say that President Biden himself appears to have written an obituary for his own comprehensive reform bill, which confusingly was a day one bill introduced on day 23, albeit more benign than previous CIR bills. But then last week, he declared in an address that it might not be possible. So this panel is going to talk about sort of, now what? What do we do given sort of these givens? And all the panelists are truth tellers in their own way. Anil, who's the sort of lone non-paid activist, is an academic and a scholar who over the years has developed a particular expertise on the interplay between exercises of discretion and courts to either ratify or rein that discretion in. Serene heads the NIP, National Immigration Project of the National Lawyers Guild, which I think of as a federation of the most badass immigration lawyers in the country. Organizers lament the role of lawyers, but I think NIP member attorneys have been a part of the beating heart of the immigrant rights movement. for the last 4 years as they've rushed to the gunfire. And definitely the best lawyers with whom to kind of grapple some of these tough questions. And then Lorella is the president of Community Change, leading a massive campaign with many partners, having previously helped build United We Dream, working with the Clinton campaign at the ACLU, and as someone who serves as a point of connection between so many people, activists, lawmakers, funders, people in the media, and does it with as much integrity, intelligence, and fearlessness as anyone I know. So to start things off, I'm going to ask each panelist to introduce themselves first, how they arrived at their work, and then a little bit about their organization's work at the moment. And then I've asked them to raise tough questions that they think need to be raised and ventilated as we move forward. And, and in keeping with Ahilan's example, which transgressed barriers in the best possible way, we're going to take those questions on Twitter and bring people into the Zoom and bring our Zoom sort of out into the world. And so I'm going to start with you, Anil, and pass the floor to you. And again, forgive the sort of prolix introduction.
Great, thanks so much, Chris. And thanks, my thanks as well to Ahilan and Hiroshi for the opportunity to participate in this really terrific conference, and my congratulations as well on the launch of this center. It's a really auspicious start for the institution. So as Chris mentioned, I've been teaching and writing about immigration law as an academic for a while. I came of age working on these issues in the mid to late 1990s while in law school, and then while working for a time at the ACLU Immigrants Rights Project, where I had the good fortune to work with Ahilan, who was also a classmate of mine in law school. And most recently, for a number of years, I've been actively involved with various committees of the New York City Bar Association, including the International Human Rights Committee, which I chaired at the time that the Trump presidency assumed office, and most recently on its task force on the rule of law. And I should, having mentioned the Bar Association, I should note that I'm here in my individual and personal capacity. I'm certainly not representing the New York City Bar, and any comments that I make may or may not reflect any positions that the City Bar has taken. But the City Bar has been quite active on immigration issues during the Trump presidency, and also some of the rule of law issues involved with independence of immigration courts, which is beneath the radar screen a little bit in public discourse, and other issues, certainly going back for a number of years. One of the things, so to take Chris's invitation to surface a provocative question or tension, I think one of the things that I have been spending a lot of time thinking about over the past several months is what are the ways in which this particular moment is distinct and might require different modes of engaging with the task of pursuing change than in the moments when many of us have come of age into doing this work in various ways. That would have been true just by virtue of an administration following the Trump presidency. I mean, there's a need to look backward to undo hundreds and hundreds of initiatives that the prior administration instituted. A lot of the things that need to be done will require political and bureaucratic capital in one form or another, and many of them are not going to be great focal points for organizing and advocacy. The American Immigration Lawyers Association published a report during the Trump presidency that they referred to the invisible wall that the Trump presidency had instituted through all of these little initiatives, many of them very technical, many of them not even very well documented, although there has been terrific work done to document all of the changes that took place. And so there's, just to sort of think about how to move forward from that set of initiatives after a extraordinarily complicated transition is itself a complicated task. But there's also, side by side with that, the difficult and challenging question of how to think about accountability for some of the most extreme actions, which is difficult both in terms of thinking about what might be necessary and appropriate, but also in terms of how to think about how much political energy to spend on any particular instance when there's so many other things that demand time and energy, and how to sort of situate the very real and important need to do things that are forward-looking with also the question of accountability in the aftermath of the Trump presidency. And of course, in the wake of the January 6th insurrection, which, all of this would have been true anyway, but I think the January 6th insurrection really just puts a finer point on, outside the immigration context, the ways in which our representative institutions are fragile. And that is also something that requires our attention writ large, but also to pursue the very change that we are seeking to pursue with respect to immigration. So I think I'll stop there and hand it back to you, Chris.
Thanks. I'm going to go to you next, Lorella.
Thank you, Chris. Nil, I feel we could spend the next hour digging into your provocative question, and I would do it with a tremendous amount of joy. Everyone, my name is Lorella Praeli. I have the great pleasure of serving as co-president of Community Change and Community Change Action, and really build power with and for low-income people, especially people of color and immigrants, really believing in a bottoms-up approach, which is how I came about. I think of myself as both product of the immigrant youth movement and also builder of the immigrant youth movement. And my very early experiences shape so much of what I bring and carry into the work every day. And there's such a strong reminder of why I do what I do. I spent 14 years of my life in the United States as an undocumented person, and have found that even the policy campaigns that we lose along the way, they transform our lives. That just to take one part of your question, Chris, and the opening, and I want to dig into this question about CIR in the last 20 years, that so many of us are products of those fights, that I would actually not be here if there was no CIR push in 2010, if there was no DREAM Act push in 2010. And so in many ways, those spaces have not produced the kind of policy outcome that we desired, and certainly not the vision that we have today in the present moment, but that they've helped to shape and build leaders like myself. And so enormously grateful for the opportunity to be here to engage in good conversation with you all. I also have the great privilege of co-chairing the We Are Home campaign, where we seek to both win citizenship for millions. It is true in a different way, just as Chris started to capture it at the front, really abandoning an all or nothing approach into really looking at what is possible. How do you push a little bit at the outer edge of the possible, but also recognize that if you give people an easy out, when you do not see a path forward in the traditional sense of the way, and in this case, I am very specifically talking about a path to 60 in the Senate where there is none, the sort of sense or pursuit of bipartisanship where there is none, not just on immigration, but on a number of issues, that has really led us to analyze and to depart from an all or nothing approach in this moment, and also ensure that we're using every tool at our disposal, particularly in the executive branch, to dismantle our enforcement apparatus. And so that's a little bit about myself. And I really don't want to surface a question because I feel like you really asked the right question, Anil, but maybe just to build on that a little bit, in light of the conversation we are having here today, I'm sitting with what is it that we do when the institutions that we rely on to make change are corrupt and broken? And how do we engage with that question in a way, not from a place of cynicism, but from a place of really trying to figure out how we engage beyond the immigrant justice agenda and understand that our movement has a stake in the fight to preserve and strengthen our democracy, in the filibuster fight, in campaign finance reform, in really building this notion and delivering on the notion of citizenship that actually goes well beyond citizenship for immigrants, and a democracy that is made real for all, knowing that it's never worked as it should for Black people, including Black immigrants, for Latinos, for low-income immigrants, for all people of color. So I am entering this conversation also from a place and a recognition that there's a tremendous amount of possibility in the moment. I don't want to suggest that there is not, but that we have these real challenges in terms of the executive branch, the state of the courts, and the legislative branch and the kind of gridlock that we see in Congress. Serene, I'll toss to you.
Thank you. So very hard acts to follow. It's wonderful to be here and wonderful to know or see on the side of my screen all of your names. I wish I could see you and we could really like kind of, go at it together here, but we're going to do our best to keep this lively, regardless of the Zoom format. I'm the executive director of the National Immigration Project, and my organization is one that, as Chris said, has always kind of played a role in actively supporting movement and advocacy and organizing and lawyering. And we do that by taking on litigation and providing training and education and being there to support the attorneys in the trenches, our members who are all across the country, who are a little bit different from other immigration attorneys in that they tend to take the really hard cases and they tend to go into court and try to really change the system in which they're working. And our mission exists to support that work in the trenches everywhere across the country, but then also centrally in the locations where we are. Our staff is actually in a lot of different places, even though we're very small, but currently we're mostly concentrated in DC with staff in New Orleans, California, New York, and Boston. And in all of those places, we try to do litigation and advocacy that actually advances the goals of the immigrant rights movement without accepting trade-offs or accepting criminal carve-outs or accepting all of those things that come as par for the course in the fight for immigrant rights. As far as my own sort of personal journey of how I came here, I am actually an Arab American immigrant. I came to the United States when I was 21, thinking that I was going to go to grad school, and then I was going to go back to Lebanon, where I was going to teach at the American University of Beirut and live in Beirut. I actually knew exactly where I wanted to live. It was all very planned out. And then, of course, here I am, 20 years later in the United States. And that's actually also part of the story of how I came to work on immigrant rights issues. I always thought that I was going to work on global justice and human rights issues generally. But that was also when I thought that I was going back to a place where that work was going to be much more kind of focused on the community that I was from. And as I started to become part of the community here, I actually wanted to focus my work on this community. And it was kind of part of a way to claim my own insider status, to realize and recognize that I have the privilege and the ability to fight to make this place better that has become my home now. And from that perspective, I think comes I am so proud to be part of an organization where I don't have to give any disclaimers. I speak for myself. I speak for my organization. I speak for all of the people who are fighting the hard fights on behalf of immigrants who have criminal convictions or who face, obstacles or who are tagged as gang members or as national security threats. Like those are the people that we fight for fundamentally in the work that we do. And the hard question that I have, again, I think it sort of relates to and builds on the questions that Anil and Lorella posed. But to me, one of the biggest questions is, as we look at the current landscape and try to get wins for the people who are most impacted by the system within this landscape, how do we do that in a way that keeps our eye on the North Star and that ensures that the solutions we're settling for today are not ones that will undermine our ultimate vision of a reality where the immigration legal systems are truly disentangled, where racial justice really exists, where the incarceration of immigrants is not something that is sort of taken for granted, like, of course, it's going to happen, where really ICE is abolished and where we can really live in a place where people can live freely and flourish and have the ability to move the way that they need to move so that they can have lives for themselves and their families without all these arbitrary distinctions. So that is the hard question that I would pose, and I will kick it back to Chris.
Yeah, well, I'm going to kick it right back to you in a second here, but this is, I think, a good way to get going. How do we, one tension that is surfaced throughout this conference, how do we set expectations higher? How do we support and build an abolitionist agenda while also meeting the concrete needs of people who need help, today and access to justice today and equality today. A first sort of interesting kind of opening measure of our ability to do this had to do with the announced moratorium on deportation, which was a little bit of a victory for, not a little bit, a victory for the advocacy community, sort of came out as a result of the Sanders-Biden transition meeting. And it was also, by the way, thwarted around the same time during lame duck, as hopefully Anil can talk about a little bit. But I wonder if we could talk about sort of that, the idea of the 100-day deportation moratorium was going to give us 100 days to have an organizing opportunity to try to pressure the best possible prioritization. But of course, it got short-circuited early. And I'm wondering, Serena, if you could sort of talk about the experience of that as a sort of, measure of the moment of where we are, and also as a bit of a cautionary tale.
Yeah, I mean, I could sort of talk a little bit about the impact of the moratorium and then the impact of the TRO that stopped it and how it kind of reflects on the landscape as we see it right now and kind of how it set up the fight that we are now fighting. And Anil and perhaps Lorella will have other thoughts to sort of contribute on different aspects of this. But, I think that we need to actually stop and own the win for a minute, that it is actually a really huge deal that an administration came in, Republican, Democratic, whatever, no, it doesn't really matter, but that administration came in and put on paper that there would be a 100-day pause on deportations. And granted, it wasn't all deportations. Of course, we were disappointed about that. But I think that that win for the movement and for the advocacy and the organizing and the very concerted discussions with the transition team and others and everything that happened over the past years and years of advocacy, I think that was actually a huge moment for the immigrant rights movement, that there was a 100-day moratorium on deportations that was put in place. The problem is that very close to that, something predictable happened, right? Which is that the Republicans who had been saying they were going to do this, right, went to the courts using a hook that they had put in place right before they left office. And they sued and they got a TRO in place because they went to a one-judge courtroom that had a judge appointed by Trump who was surely going to give them a win. And so they got a temporary restraining order that stopped this moratorium from going into effect. And Anil can talk a little bit more maybe about the sort of the details of that litigation. But to me, the really disappointing moment is that the Biden administration kind of stepped back and fizzled, they did not fight the moratorium with everything they had. They didn't decide to go to court and go to bat and bring their best arguments for why there is decades-long tradition for how the executive has the discretion to not deport people in their own discretion, and how there's a tradition of prosecutorial discretion across fields, not just in immigration, and how there were many, many kind of arguments that they could have made very forcefully. They could have chosen to appeal. I know that there are many sort of factors that might have kind of been weighing on this decision, but to me, the fact that they chose not to fight signaled that that is the way to stop these things from happening, and that they were afraid of the litigation and that they weren't going to really stand up for the things they said they were going to do for the community. That it was almost as though they put this moratorium in place so that, they could sort of say, oh, we did this. And then as soon as it was challenged, they didn't actually stand up and fight for it. And I think that is the piece that, continues to sort of color every moment. I mean, we're going to talk about legislation in a minute, but even the Biden bill was supposed to be different from what it ultimately was when it was put in, because of these sort of constant rolling back the commitment that they said they were going to make, or not being willing to actually fight for the thing that they said they were going to do, because they bought into a framework about racial justice and immigration and how those things need to be viewed as one and the same fight. And I think that the moment when they decided not to fight back hard against the TRO was a moment when they signaled to us that we were once again going to be fighting these fights on our own in a lot of ways.
And now I'm going to kick it to you, and I'll ask, you recently wrote a really great law review article on the Tipton decision. And do you think that that's a fair characterization? Did the Biden administration not fight back hard enough? Should they have fought back harder? You've talked about in your law review article the kind of strategic entrenchment that's been built by 4 years of Trump. I wonder if you could kind of elaborate a little bit on how you read the fight over, after the announcement and sort of the injunction, the 100-day moratorium.
Sure. I mean, I think that I actually want to focus a little bit less on the, looking back at the decision to appeal or not appeal, although, because I think there may be things that we can talk about it. There are certainly things that might have been complicated given the makeup of the the appellate courts and the Supreme Court at this point, as terms of whether, that would have been the best use of energy. Although there's no denying, I totally understand and agree with what Serena's saying about the implications of not pursuing that fight. But I'll circle back to that in a moment, but I want to focus on a couple of other things about the decision and and really how suddenly it came. I mean, to me, that decision signals maybe three things that are worth lingering on. First is that the immigration backlash politics of the last decade has obviously solidified quite a bit, right? I mean, we've seen the politics of immigration backlash develop over a number of years. I mean, we could go all the way back to DAPA or even further, DACA, or the 2010, 2009-2010 Administrative Alternatives Memo in the fight over the DREAM Act. And it has become, Chris, as you know, I've described it, drawing upon scholars who've written about entrenchment, as a politics of strategic entrenchment in this moment, in the following sense. I mean, it certainly has always been the case that outgoing presidents try and find ways that they can tie the hands of their successors. That's not unusual. It's sort of an ongoing, lingering tension whenever you have a new administration of a different party. But this moment is more unusual and more irregular and more aggressive in a variety of ways. And that has, we can situate that in the irregular nature of the transition more generally. But, you had the outgoing presidency entering into these legally questionable agreements with the ICE Employees Union and a number of local jurisdictions around the country that were controlled by Republican elected officials, where they were making no bones about the fact that, and I think a former Trump administration official was quoted anonymously in news reports to say that the whole point was 110% to screw the incoming administration and keep them from doing anything for 6 months. That is a different kind of transition and moment with different kinds of implications. And it came really quickly. So that's a different kind of politics that we have to reckon with in this moment. And I think the moratorium illustrates that. The second thing that it illustrates for me is that politics of backlash and entrenchment has also come to the federal judiciary. This lawsuit was steered to Judge Tipton because, relatively easily, you could file in the ordinary course where they filed and pretty much be sure that it would go to the only judge sitting in that division of the Southern District of Texas. We've, of course, seen that movie before in the litigation challenging DAPA also in the Southern District of Texas, which was very effectively brought before Judge Andrew Hannon. But of course, now we have a judiciary that's been transformed, and perhaps we might even say Josh Marshall has said corrupted under the past administration, and so the nature of the decision making, again, we saw with Judge Hannon in the DAPA litigation, sort of having really a somewhat questionable relationship with facts in the context of that litigation. And there is some of that here too, in that the decisions that Judge Tipton issued really do seem to reflect and incorporate and propagate some of the same discourse and moves that were made in political discourse about immigration and the the initiatives that the Biden administration has been seeking to do. And that litigation is in fact broader than just challenging the moratorium. There's still, and there are other lawsuits that have been filed challenging the Biden administration's effort to establish its own immigration priorities. And again, thinking about this in the context of the broader fragility of representative institutions and democratic electoral processes, that casts a different light on how we think about the politics of entrenchment in this context, I think, and that may have some implications for how we think about how to engage this moment. And then finally, the last thing I'll note is that the moratorium, presumably, along, as Serene noted, the authority to engage in this kind of initiative is pretty clear, and it's somewhat surprising maybe it shouldn't be surprising for the reasons I just noted, but it's not, to my mind, a very strong set of decisions that Judge Tipton has issued. But this was supposed to be, I mean, presumably these were the things that the administration did first because they were the most straightforward and easy to accomplish in guidance memos, as opposed to pursuing a program of relief that you might predict would be more contested and where there would be more resistance. This presumably was one of the more easy and straightforward initiatives to do, and still there was this sharp resistance. So what that says to me is we need to be prepared for the bigger things, to think carefully about where the political capital needs to be spent going forward, because there will be resistance to everything, and we have to be ready for those fights.
I think that's such a great point to land on, because when we think about sort of the exercise of discretion from President Biden and the executive branch, it is sort of an exercise of authority, but it's also an investment of political capital. And I wonder, Lorella, if you could sort of, kind of give a grade of sorts in the first 100 days, both in terms of the way in which, discretion has been exercised to date. I know all of us heard the same thing from the White House. So, they didn't know where the staplers were when they first, moved in, and that, there wasn't staffing, but also the question of investment of political capital in the first 100 days. I wonder how you see it.
That's a really good question, Chris. And just before I take that, just to transition, because I feel like part of the conversation, the thing that we haven't said about the moratorium is also how we were not ready to defend it and to fight for it narratively in the streets. And, to give us some grace in this moment, it is also the case that we are in a pandemic, that there was a lot coming at us, that it was such an unusual transition, as you just said, Anil. And at the same time, I don't believe that all is lost. I agree with Serene. The moratorium was a win, perhaps a lost opportunity, but we move forward. And I want to say that before I answer your question, Chris, and remind us that we still have 4 years of Trump making plain and visible the harms of the enforcement system. We still have detention at historic lows. And so court is one place where we win, where we can win, but it's certainly not the only place. Now, in looking at and assessing the first 100 days of the Biden administration, I think they came out strong in wanting to deliver on the commitments, some of the commitments that he had made, issuing a moratorium on deportations, sending a bill to Congress that, at least in the beginning, really sought to change the conversation, did not sort of adopt the kind of traditional CIR framework. And in a number of different fronts, where I have been disappointed is in understanding the politics of the moment and the vehicles to make change. And one of those vehicles to make change is in Congress. And the way in which the Biden administration got the American Rescue Plan done was via reconciliation. There's a lot of talk about bipartisanship and trying to get to 60 and find a way forward on any number of issues. But Republicans show us over and over again that they, in fact, have no desire to engage in bipartisanship, to want to deliver on anything. And so it feels to me like if you are introducing your vision for an economic recovery via the American Jobs Plan, via the American Families Plan, and immigrants, knowing the role that they play in this moment and have played, are not included in that vision, that to me is a disappointment. It continues to be, immigration is thought about as sort of standing on its own lane, as opposed to immigrants and immigration as part of our broader economic recovery vision, racial justice vision for how we move forward. And so, and then there's been the disappointments that Serene talked about earlier, and their early prosecutorial, their temporary or interim guidelines on prosecutorial discretion and the priorities. And so I think it's a mixed bag. I think they came strong. And what's more important from my perspective is what they do the next 100 days. So we're through this first period. What the next 100 days are actually going to tell us a lot more about how the Biden administration engages on this issue, what kind of political capital they're ready to expend, both administratively and legislatively, where they're wanting to and willing to have the fights on immigration and immigrant justice, how they see this issue and how it intersects with the broader economic and social justice agenda for our country. And so I don't believe it's the end of it for sure, but that the next 100 days is more important. That at this point you're staffed up. At this point, you have a lay of the land of what you've walked into, what kind of challenges you have in the agencies, what kind of challenges are there because of the workforce, the kind of tricks that the previous administration placed for you. And it's an opportunity to really shift and to own how it is that you're going to govern on the issue. So it's not so much the last 100 days or the first 100 days that I'm interested in. It's the next 100, Chris.
Thanks. And just to button up this conversation about the moratorium, I mean, one of the things that I thought was most disappointing about it was that it did seem to invite the type of activism and organizing that led to DACA in the first place. If the moratorium were to go into effect, people could have gone, much as young immigrant rights leaders learned with the Morton memos, that there was a sort of benefit to doing civil disobedience and saying, here I am, I'm not a priority. You said you can't deport me. Now give me, deferred action and work authorization. And I think that was deprived, unfortunately, the ability to sort of use that mechanism, that win, as everyone pointed out, as a means to instigate and inspire activism. I want to turn the conversation a little bit to legislation now. I have a mentor who always tells me, say, calm down, Chris, with your critique of CIR. All good legislation throughout history, we think of it as inevitable, but actually all great legislation only had a 5% chance of passing at the time, and then you get major breakthroughs in legislation. So I don't know if I'm being too unfair in sort of saying that the prospects for legislation seem small. So I'm going to first go back to you, Lorella, to sort of give various different scenarios in which we can imagine a breakthrough where a bill is signed into law this year that would actually provide a mass legalization. How do you see it happening? Again, even recognizing that we don't know, we can't, sort of discount, we're not Vegas odd makers, but the odds are against us. We got to push, and it could happen. How could it happen?
Mm-hmm. I feel more optimistic. I don't believe that the path forward isn't an uphill climb, but it is a climb that we're prepared. It is a hill that we're prepared to climb, Chris. And I'm always on the opposite end of where you are with my optimism. So I will bring that happily into this conversation. I think that there are really two paths for a legislative breakthrough this year. There is reconciliation, a 51 vote strategy, and there is filibuster reform or repeal of the filibuster. That we don't have the luxury to wait for Republicans or for bipartisan gestures where we already know how Republicans show up on our issue. But that if Democrats want to get it done, there are two ways to get it done this year via legislation. And they have to decide that they're willing to go to the mat for immigrants, that they're going, we cannot do 11 million people. We cannot do all of the structural reforms that we want to our immigration system beyond a path to citizenship via reconciliation. So we're going to hit a limit on what we can do. But can we potentially deliver a path to citizenship for young undocumented people, for TPS holders, for essential workers, for farm workers? I think the answer is yes. If we can't do that, can we try for registry? Can we try for 245I? Maybe. And that's the current focus of the campaign and the work. Now, if we can't do that, then the path before us is really to repeal the filibuster. And both of these things point both to members of Congress and to Senate Democratic leadership for sure, but they really point to President Biden and his willingness to deliver on the vision that he promised, not just on immigration, Chris. This is true on the care agenda in the current conversation about the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan. And if we understand, as Mitch McConnell himself said at the outset of the Biden administration, that his commitment is to stop them from doing anything, then you've got to figure out, well, how do we ride without them, right? How do they get things done in a way that does not require any Republican engagement? And so that's the way forward on legislation from my perspective.
Serene, you're in the position of advocating on behalf of and with people who are deemed undeserving and sort of, on the carve out side of things. Do you feel that, does it put you in a bad position to have to sort of, say that the legalization provisions that are being considered and politically possible are not ample enough, or they exclude too many people and cause too much sort of zero sum harm? How do you see the issue of trade-offs and enforcement as a potential poison pill serving as an obstacle to get to legislation that's signed into law?
I mean, in some ways, I think that is, for us, the $1 million question of how do you engage in this work so that you're actually supporting the goal of legalization for as many people as possible, but supporting it in a way that makes it as bold and inclusive as it can be. And I think maybe instead of sort of answering your question as you asked it, I might actually pose, shift a little bit and talk about different legislation. I just want to name and mention a bill that was introduced for the second time this year in the House called the New Way Forward Act. And that bill is sort of like a visionary North Star bill that really takes on and addresses some of the worst excesses of the 1996 laws, and really tries to sort of craft a North Star on enforcement and criminal immigration issues only. And that is what that bill does. The bill would eliminate mandatory detention. It would redefine convictions for immigration purposes so that that matches the definition of convictions on the criminal legal side, which currently is not the case in immigration. It would end deportations based on certain convictions. It would restore judicial discretion, would create a 5-year statute of limitations on deportation, would establish an opportunity to come home for people who were deported wrongfully. And I think even in the description of the New Way Forward bill, you can still see that it's sort of incremental in the sense that it doesn't go to say nobody should ever be deported for contact with the criminal legal system, even though that's actually what we believe. But the bill itself is sort of like a North Star that people can start using to build and educate and create a different narrative around the racial justice issues that are inherent in the immigration system, and a different way of looking at enforcement issues than the way that people sort of normally come to them. The reason I'm raising this in the context of legalization, even though they seem like very different things, because this bill has nothing to do with legalization, isn't really talking about that, is that I think in introducing a bill like this and in going to congressional offices and doing the education that we do when we're talking about this bill, and in sort of lifting up the organizing around this bill from community groups across the country and 300 organizations that have endorsed it, we can also be sending a message at the same time as those conversations about legalization are happening that people are actually asking for something a little bit different this time. And in the context of legalization, I would say that one of the biggest challenges has been to defeat this idea that if you don't have terrible criminal carve-outs in every legalization bill, that somehow the bill can't pass, or that people would be jeopardizing themselves by voting in favor of it. To me, it's like a very self-perpetuating narrative. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like if you walk around as Democrats and say, we can't do this because that's gonna, stop our chances from getting the bill to passage, you're making that a reality because you're not actually leaning on your caucus in the moment when you have a majority, slim though it might be. And that's not going to come again. And to me, it's like a lack of leadership and a lack of willingness to actually be statespeople as opposed to looking out for their own next race. And I think that dynamic really comes to a head when legalization conversations start all the time, because that is such a prime opportunity for talking about trade-offs. Like every time legalization comes up, people start talking about enforcement. When we talk about DACA, people start saying border. Like every time that anything having to do with benefits is raised, it sort of opens the door to starting to talk about, well, what really are your red lines on the crime stuff? Like there has to be a place where you'd be okay with it. And And I think that we as a movement just have not figured out like what is the right way to actually push back against that and say, no, we actually want a clean Dream and Promise Act, and we all want a clean Dream and Promise Act. And we're not going to be okay with having all of these crazy criminal bars that are included. I think that in a way, like a hopeful and optimistic moment, but another way, like a little bit of a reflection of the depressing reality. Like we kind of, a group of organizations came together and really pushed very hard for the introduction of an amendment that would take out some of the worst criminalizing pieces of the Dream and Promise Act, which ended up being introduced with a lot of bad things. Like it was introduced with various criminal carve-outs, and then also a secondary review process that would put anyone who had ever been convicted of anything that theoretically could be punishable by 30 days in jail, which is basically like anything at all, would be put into the secondary review process that would sort of then go to things like juvenile adjudications and labels of gang involvement, which are extremely fraught with racism and kind of all the different problems that I don't think I have time to actually get into all of it here. But so there was a big push to get people to say, we don't want this in the bill. And that push, like, just in the procedural posture that it was unprecedented in that it got 48 people to sign on to this amendment that was supposed to be, normally it's like one person on an amendment. And we had 48 people signing on to that amendment to say, take that process out for various reasons having to do with leadership and what leadership was asking people to do. The amendment was eventually withdrawn, but 5 members of Congress actually spoke out on the floor about the missed opportunity and the moment of racial reckoning that we're in, and how by continuing to adopt these frames, we are actually continuing to perpetuate those moments. And to me, that was actually a small win, because our game with respect to these issues is a very long game. And it is a win when 5 members of Congress are willing to stand up, despite the fact that everyone's telling them to shut up, and say on the floor, I support this bill because there are too many who have been waiting too long to get citizenship. But I want to tell you that this is the wrong way to go about it. And that 48 people were willing to put their names to an amendment that says, take out this horrible stuff from the bill. To me, that is a moment of a win. And again, it's depressing that that is a win for us right now, but I think it still means something, because there's like an education process that is happening that, even 4 years ago, we couldn't have imagined this many people would stand up for that proposition.
Can we stay with that for a second, Serene? Because I do feel like it takes time. It takes time to make the case, to elect the right people, to put our champions in seats of power, to build the narrative and to create the political space for this kind of change that for our North Star to happen. And there's a way in which we can have this conversation where everything feels depressing. And there are things to be depressed about. And rather than being sad about it, for all of us as organizers to actually be agitated enough about the state of our democracy, the state of our courts, the state of our Congress, the state of the issues, to use that as fuel to organize many more people. And so I don't want to lose that part of the conversation. These things take time, right? It took many decades of work to pass the Civil Rights Act. It took decades to do the Voting Rights Act. It took a century to get health reform. And even many of these bills are imperfect. Many of the outcomes are imperfect. And so we are, the system that we're fighting within is messy and imperfect. The political institutions are messy and imperfect. And our movement also is full of messy and imperfect people, myself included. So we can't get perfect outcomes from an imperfect system. But what has changed by virtue of transitions in leadership in an immigrant justice movement, you being where you are, Serene, young people being at the forefront of the efforts, is we are changing the politics little by little. And frankly, much of that work does not live or start at the national level. It is seated on the ground. It is seated in places like Arizona. It is seated in places like California. And Chris, you've led so much of that work. And those kinds of fights, they give us the kind of fuel to have the conversation and to push the boundaries of the possible at the federal level. And so, yes, we've got a ton of work to do, but the fact that we're even having the conversation in the way that we're having it, it feels like a long time because it's our lived experience. Because maybe you've been in it for 10 years or 20 years, But you cannot today say that we are exactly where we were in terms of where our ability to hold elected officials accountable, the expectations that we create around legislating on immigration, than where we were 10 years ago, 20 years ago. I mean, 10 years ago, we couldn't get all of the Democrats in the Senate to support the DREAM Act, right? And so we have to take that into account. And it's not just on immigration. We see today much more widespread understanding of the harms of over-policing, of mass incarceration, and punitive law enforcement. So it really is a reflection of the moment, the racial justice reckoning that we're literally living through as a country right now. And it really is thanks to Black organizers and advocates who have been toiling for decades. The kind of work that many people who are a part of this conference have been speaking at this conference, the kind of work that you've done, the kind of work that we've done is we've taken enforcement issues from the margins to the center. And that in and of itself is an accomplishment. It does not change the system on its own. It does not deliver citizenship for everyone on its own, but it is making progress. And frankly, if we choose to do the work, if we choose to be in the fight to begin with, this is what comes with it.
And these points are really well taken, but I mean, and Nell, are you going to jump in? I see you unmuting.
Yeah, is that all right? So I first of all, I just want to completely agree with Lorella that the next 100 days is much more important than the first 100 days. I mean, especially in the wake of the kind of transition that it took place. The reconciliation filibuster reform, I want to just sort of linger on that for a second and make a couple of observations. One is that, first of all, we need to have filibuster reform at the end of the day, right? That we should not actually ultimately lose sight of that. But they're also not mutually exclusive. The pursuit of one may still require that ultimately the filibuster is eliminated, and tying there are virtues and costs of each kind of strategy. The filibuster reform is a matter of concern to a lot of different people and groups because of a lot of different issues. And that is an opportunity to tie the immigrants' rights agenda, the legalization agenda, immigration reform agenda to a lot of other groups that are thinking about why we need to get rid of the filibuster. And that may or may not present itself in the same way with reconciliation, but they're not mutually exclusive. The second cautionary note I would make about both of those approaches, not so much about the approaches themselves, but about how we engage those approaches, is that there's a really strong tendency and risk to then get this gravitational pull of the weeds of legislative process and, what is the parliamentarian going to do? And, all of this inside baseball stuff that has a dampening effect on mobilizing people. And, the third piece of legislation is, 100% agreeing with what's already been said, is, outside of what's where the legislative process itself, it's the organizing, and the narratives that are constructed. And here, it's not just what communities can do and organizers can do, but also executive action can shape what legislation looks like. I mean, Adam Cox and Christina Rodriguez have documented this in their compelling new book. And there was a symposium in Just Security where Tom Jowitz, I believe, had there were a bunch of people, including Hiroshi, who engaged this book very closely. And one of the points that Tom Jowitz made in his response in that symposium was that executive action can create the foundation for subsequent legislation. But not just in terms of the policies. I think it also, it's important to have those executive actions also go hand in hand with narratives about what those executive actions are trying to do with an eye towards legislation. I mean, immigrants' rights advocacy has always been about narratives, and people who litigate in inhospitable judicial environments where the case law and the doctrine is not on your side have always understood that. Whenever there's a major Supreme Court case involving immigration, or very often at least, there's often an amicus brief that has, here is the tangible implications, here are the stories about the technicalities of the law. And there's no reason why in this kind of moment there can't and shouldn't be multiple arenas in which those kinds of narratives are constructed in support of legislative agendas. And I think it's pretty crucial that that happen. I think back to the primary campaign, in which, if you lined up a number of the different policy proposals of the different candidates, they were saying similar things in terms of just the dry policy. One of the things that stood out for me about Elizabeth Warren's immigration plan, and across the board, a lot of her plans, is that they were constructed to narratives that were intended to draw people in. And I think that when we think about executive action, even, there's a role for the executive branch to play in doing that.
I'm going to stick with you, Noah, on that, because it's the second time I've heard you mention that sort of some of the decisions that are made in the weeds could have a counterproductive or a dampening role on organizing. You talked about first the need for some of the sort of the myriad, Lucas Gutentag has outlined all the different policy changes, and some of those changes in terms of won't be conducive to sort of inviting organizing. And then the warning on focusing on the parliamentarian as also potentially a way of dampening organizing. It strikes me that part of what went wrong with the Obama administration was that there was a sort of leading with legislation first and then a sort of exercise of discretion and investment of political capital. I also really worry, frankly, about the Biden administration making so much about the point of delivering on its promise to have a bill on day one, which by its very introduction sort of proves its own impossibility. I'm wondering if we could flip that on its head and think about sort of, what if we were leading with sort of exercises of discretion as a means of unlocking the potential for legislation? And I wonder what ideas you would have along those lines, both to catalyze organizing and also potentially to dislodge the ability to make legislation more likely.
Sure. I mean, so just maybe to clarify what perhaps maybe a misimpression I left, I don't think that any of those things are things that shouldn't be done. To the contrary, I think that executive actions that are beneath the radar screen and legislation in one of the forms or both that Lorella described need to happen. It's not so much that I am concerned, I think that people shouldn't engage that. It's just that there are risks involved in how they're engaged, in that they may or may not so much that they would dampen organizing this, they may not actually affirmatively pull people in. And that's observational. I say that with a lot of humility for the people, with respect to the people who are actually doing that work. But I think that there is sort of an established track record of the value of constructing narratives that actually activate people. And sometimes the procedural, nitty gritty isn't what does that. And whether that's in immigration or in other contexts. In terms of actually in the executive branch affirmatively taking a role in constructing forms, use of discretion to have forbearance in one form or another, whether it's parole or expansion of deferred action or whatever it might be. I mean, there's good reason to think that's something that the administration should be prepared to do. Some of the questions that would have to be answered are about, thinking about what the optimal timing is in terms of the relationship to a legislative strategy, and also doing so in a manner, just going back to the first point that we were discussing earlier in this conversation about what then will be necessary to engage with the predictable backlash politics that is in response, which isn't a reason to run scared. It's to me is a reason to just think carefully about how and when, and also to think about how different actors can play different roles. I mean, there's certainly can be a division of labor in civil society between government actors and civil society, and thinking about how to engage that political backlash when it arrives.
I want to get in on this question, Chris, because I do think I come down on timing as the determinant for this. So I think that the year for transformative legislation is this year on the issue of immigration and on other issues. that the clock is running, is running out. And so there is that is not to say you should do this, you can only focus on this, but it is to say, if we believe that the way or the path to a legislative outcome on immigration is via reconciliation, and there are big bills moving, they are not moving next year, they're happening now. It's just that simple from my perspective on legislation. And so we can decide to sit it out and not engage in the current fight and instead focus exclusively on administrative reforms, but it comes at a cost. Whereas, and I think that we've got more time, that we have to carry at the same time an administrative reform strategy and work forward now, and also that we have more time. That there are no guarantees that Democrats will hold on to every branch of government in 22 or in 24, for that matter.
So what do we do for the next, oh, you can get in there, sorry.
Yeah, I also kind of wanted to jump in on this because I think that the interrelation between these things is really like very high. So like, I absolutely agree with you, Lorella, that the timing is critical. Like this year is critical, and what happens this year is setting the tone for anything that can be possible afterwards for a variety of reasons, including the ones that you have raised. I also think though that like, if we're not pushing very hard on the executive to do things right now, the sort of feedback loop between the administration and Congress, who are all kind of looking to each other to see like who's going to do what, to show like where, I just think that reinforces the kind of cowardice that we're seeing among members of Congress to really push something. And it's not like I don't like, you know, I hope that it's true that these things are going to happen and that, you know, there's going to be passage of legalization through reconciliation, and et cetera. But I also think that, like, going back to the conversation we were having earlier, for example, about the moratorium, I mean, one piece of the disappointment was that they didn't really push back hard against the TRO. But another piece of it was that, like, you know, almost immediately we started sending the materials, and law professors sent a letter, and everybody was telling them, look, like, leave aside the blanket moratorium, you have absolutely the authority to exercise discretion in individual cases. That's something that Scalia said in a Supreme Court opinion, you know, like that is not a questionable proposition. And so they set up this review process that actually has resulted in denials of discretion to almost uniformly across the board to people who both fit the articulated priorities or don't. And like everybody knows that that's what's happening. And so the signals that people are getting from the administration when they're in the legislature and from the legislative branch when you're in the administration is that, like, everybody's waiting for the other person to start first on the enforcement stuff or on the exercises of prosecutorial discretion. I think that like builds a sort of like an atmosphere in which nobody's really like pushing hard because they're kind of looking to each other. And I think that is like one reason why it's so important to actually be pushing really, really hard on administrative advocacy right now and on the executive branch to do what it can, because taking a courageous stand and showing that kind of leadership is also going to help reinforce legislation that happens. And there is like another piece of this, which we haven't really talked about a lot, which is litigation and how that can support. I mean, one of the really kind of big, you know, like watershed moments in the formation or the history of the National Immigration Project actually was the ABC versus Thornburg case, which is a case that was brought along the border on behalf of community groups and faith groups and you know, a whole host of kind of movement and organizing that was brought in litigation that everybody said should never be brought, that challenged discrimination against Central Americans in the grant of asylum. And that litigation not only was hugely successful and resulted in a settlement agreement that continues to this day to give benefits to people who otherwise wouldn't have benefits. It also propelled the NACARA statute, which was a statute that was passed, which was legislation that was passed that then gave benefits. So like, to me, it's like, and I don't think this actually at odds with anything that, you know, either you, Lorella, or Anil was saying, but like, to me, it's like those three things have to be pursued at the same time and in a smart and strategic way so that all the goals are reinforcing each other. But if we let the executive off the hook now because we're really focused on the legislature, that's just going to reinforce like a feedback loop of cowardice on all fronts. I mean, sorry to kind of call it that, but I kind of feel like that's what ends up happening.
Yeah, I just want to say it is the reason why we designed We Are Home in the way that we did, to take on both the executive branch and to take on both the legislative branch. I think I was talking more about affirmative categorical administrative reform policy a la DACA in this moment. And I think it's worth spending more time on that because it gives people the ability to sort of pass the buck, as opposed to really being able to hold them accountable when you have a critical window. But there is no reason, let me just be 100% clear here, there is no reason for the Biden administration to not move on, say, TPS for Haiti, for Central America, for other countries that qualify under the TPS statute. There's no reason for the executive branch to not utilize its extraordinary authority on immigration, as we saw under Trump. There is no reason for the Biden administration to take action now in this moment to reduce harm by dismantling the enforcement apparatus so it can't restart again in 4 years, to cut detention, to close facilities, to end the use of private prisons for immigration detention, with a view toward ultimately ending detention, to end 287G, and the list goes on. So it really is a question of choice. Now, it does bring me back to something you said earlier, Anil, and if we don't get time to talk about it here, I definitely want to do a sidebar with you, which is the use of political capital. That you're up against so much bureaucracy, that the fights that you choose matter. And so how do we, I guess I would love to dig in a little bit more with this crew about how to engage with that question, how to engage in that question when we have the kind of agenda that we have in this moment. So how do we get the most that we can out of these 4 years? What does that look like? What are some of the barriers that we're going to face? How does timeline sort of factor into that conversation? How does political capital, how do elections factor in? And all of that potentially leads to a conversation also about our leverage in this moment. So what is our leverage to win and to get them to act, either legislatively or rather legislatively and administratively?
All that is bringing, sort of a worry that the conversation is starting to get cooking here a little bit with 15 minutes left in the panel, which is, was one of my worries. Let me just flash back to Serene. I just think a +1 to the idea that I think another panel or a conference or discussion about how we use all the litigation that was, instigated against the Trump administration, which corresponded with a rapid acceleration of kind of the wokeification in the best sense of the immigrant rights movement in the context of resisting Trump. Thinking about how we use some of that litigation that's already in play strategically as leverage, I think would be a great conversation for, particularly Hiroshi and Ahilan to kind of, set the table for. But for the next 100 days, I think if I'm summarizing everyone, we all, we have in some sense, the best Secretary of Homeland Security we could hope for. He's got a heart, at least, unlike previous one, knows a lot about the law, doing the best he can, dealing with a rogue law enforcement agency that shouldn't exist, all those givens. But for the next 100 days, we really want President Biden, Vice President Harris to do more, to unlock the potential for legislation, to unlock the potential for greater exercise of discretion. But you can already start to feel some familiar divisions happening in the immigrant rights advocacy community between those that feel a need to kind of praise the administration and kind of hope into existence that they're going to do the right thing, and those who are starting to say, hey, no, we got to start right now protesting, trying to kind of, create space. If we're turning the conversation to the next 100 days and what we can do, and I really think multiple people have said, let's not focus on them to a degree. Let's focus on us and what we can do better as advocates. What can we do to kind of help encourage President Biden to invest more capital, political capital, and how do we do that in a way that doesn't recreate familiar divisions? Because you can already start to feel again what happened with the Obama administration. We have to do enforcement first. We have to do secure communities. It's a predicate for, the getting, setting the table for Congress. You can already see it start to feel in various ways with root causes, discourse, and again, whether we should be protesting, do more to defend the 100-day moratorium. Are any of you worried about that, or how do you reconcile it? What can we do to kind of?
Well, so if I could jump in on this, I think that it's really important to sort of, as we see those kinds of potential divisions, or as you describe them reemerging, to just step back and think about the ways in which how should the distinctiveness of this moment cause us to think about what we are seeing and experiencing differently? Because there remains the underlying fragility of, not just our institutions, really our civil society and our, democratic society that is the context in which all of these issues are emerging. And if we don't lose sight of that, then we can continue to have those fights emerge, and it'll all be for a futile end. A couple other things that I would just sort of put into the mix. Then maybe this is just sort of bookmarking for a future conversation. That I've been thinking a lot about this idea of sort of division of labor and sort of the underlying fragility. How should that there's a couple of things that I don't want us to lose sight of the backward-looking need for accountability. But also, I don't think we have fully documented and sort of made aware to the public everything that has happened in the previous administration. My hope is that is something also that can be done by this administration, so that then that's a way of facilitating division of labor. There are civil society groups that can do the work of engaging what happened over the past 4 years and not put that on the movement actors and the legislative advocates who are and the folks in the administration themselves, actually, that are trying to be forward-looking. In a similar vein, if it really is the case that we have the kind of narrow window that Lorella has described, and I think that it's pretty widely understood that that's a risk. What are the kinds of things that can be done through executive action that is a little bit more solidified, whether that's notice and comment rulemaking, or the kinds of executive actions that become harder to reverse to facilitate longer term change? I think we need to be thinking about that too.
Serene, you want to get? Were you unmuting or?
Yeah, I mean, I can, or you can say what you're going to say, and then. I mean, I was just going to say that I actually really agree with this idea of trying to sort of push the administration to take on actions that are really much more solidified than kind of memos or, guidance here and there. I just think that we also still need to continue to push. And I totally agree that the next 100 days are equally important, if not more important. We just need to continue to push for them to adopt a framework that is actually fundamentally different from the framework that they have adopted so far. I just don't want us to lose sight of that point. Like, the interim enforcement priorities are definitely different from things that we've seen before in some ways, but in their application, they're actually exactly the same. Like, we're not actually seeing a lot of, decisions that are showing a fundamental transformation in the way that they're evaluating immigration cases or the need for enforcement in particular cases. And so I just think that, while totally in agreement that we should, be pushing for, and I guess I just saw on Twitter, and I just did want to elevate that. I think Ahilan was asking, should the push now then be for another moratorium? And I actually think that that's a really great question. And possibly the answer should be yes. Like, what is the big organizing, big ask that we're making of the administration kind of as a movement, in addition to the small incremental things that they're going to do anyway? I think it's another moratorium, but I think more fundamentally, it's an acknowledgement of the fact that they really need to restaff their agency soup to nuts if they're going to achieve the culture shift that's going to enable them to even make the reforms that they've said that they want to make.
Well, I mean, I love both Anil's suggestion that we continue to unify around a common threat, which was the administration, and make sure that we have, truth and reconciliation, however you want to describe it, and accountability for the atrocities. And that's a great place to find unity. And we can even, I think, exert pressure on the administration to do that. And I really love Ahilan's suggestion again on Twitter, which was great to see that happen, that perhaps another unifying sort of vector for advocacy would be to ask again for a do-over on the moratorium, to do it in a way that either obviates or moots the litigation, or is just done in a different way. I think that's a great thing that's worth considering as well. Lorella, it looks like you're unmuting, so I don't know if you have some thoughts about how to how we can get them to do more at this moment, in this critical moment in the next 100 days.
I do. I go back to the fundamentals, Chris. I go back to the fundamentals in organizing, and that starts with understanding and appreciating always being grounded in one truth, and that's both the power of the people and that there are no shortcuts to power. And if you understand that there are no shortcuts to power, and you believe that you can deliver big change in this country, if you believe in the power of people, if you commit to organizing and changing the lives of people we are fighting for so that they are at the forefront of the fights, that much possibility unlocks if you commit to that fight. The other key lesson from the Obama years, in my view, that we have to apply here is to remember the who and the why, and to not get confused about our role in this moment. We are not an extension of the Biden White House. We are not an extension of the Democratic Senate or the Democratic House. We are advocates. We are fighters. And if we ground in our role, why shouldn't we push? Why shouldn't we have high expectations? Why should we not experiment? We're going to fall and we're going to stumble along the way. And we're also going to find different paths. That's actually the story behind DACA. And you are uniquely familiar with that story, intimately familiar with that story. And so the answers did not present themselves. They were built over time. They were interrogated. They were solidified. We made the case. We campaigned. And so that's part of the answer. And I'm also sitting through this conversation with the fact that we are living in a different moment. And so we also can't only rely on our traditional tools alone or only. So the rise of misinformation and disinformation, it's a different reality we have to contend with today, and the impact of that on helping to promote that kind of immigrant backlash that you've talked about, Anil, and the kind of entrenchment that you've talked about. And so, how do we also move in through this moment in a way that gets us out of an immigrant-only frame? That those are some of the lessons learned from the previous fights. How are we much more integrated with the broader majoritarian agenda in this country, so that we are not, by virtue of the way in which we carry out our work, putting ourselves, othering ourselves and putting our own issue at the margins of the fight? How do we integrate with the broader progressive movement? And so there are lessons learned, and a lot of this goes back to the fundamentals of organizing in this moment. And so I don't believe that the road ahead ever is easy. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing the work. There would be no need for the kind of work that we do. But if we double down, if we elect people who are going to represent us and fight for us, if we commit to the fights on the ground that make some of that change the national politics, if we hold the Bidens of the world, the Schumers of the world, the Pelosi's of the world accountable, if we make sure that the Padillas of the world and others actually go in there and fight. And I've seen people show up in different ways right now. And if we do it in a way that really centers the experience of people who are undocumented, we've got a shot.
Those are, I almost feel like, those are very great kind of valedictorial comments to kind of end on. I don't know if Serena or Anil, if you want to sort of, have some closing thoughts. We have a couple more minutes before Ahilan comes in and cuts us off. So I don't know, Serena, if you want to share some closing thoughts as well.
Yeah, they won't be valedictorian in the way that Lorella's comments were. I also agree they're great closing comments, but I did want to lift up, there is a question in the Q&A about Fix 96 and how talking about mandatory detention and those laws need to be reformed, and that there is more education that's needed, even or especially in activist circles, about these things. I kind of just wanted to lift that up as my last contribution here, which is that's absolutely why the New Way Forward Act exists, and why it's so important for example, people like Senator Padilla to take that bill on and sponsor it, and for others in Congress to be focused on that bill, and for us as advocates to also be organizing around the themes that come out of bills that really very overtly deal with enforcement. So, in parallel with advocacy to the administration, I think we should really be not losing sight of the fact that even though this isn't a bill that any of us thinks is going to pass now, it's actually really important to organize around it because it does highlight the 1996 laws and how they've created the situation we're in now and how they really need to be fundamentally reformed and fixed. And so just to kind of lift up that question from the Q&A and say that I absolutely agree and that that's what the New Way Forward Act is supposed to do. And that's why we continue to work on it in this moment and going forward.
I want to, if I can, just run the risk of running a minute over, Ahilan, before you cut my mic. I see Odelia is a colleague raising on Twitter something that I raise, which is the need to find intersectional agreement with the indigenous rights movement in this country and the migrant rights movement. I'm sorry that sort of only getting to this on as a sort of postscript to our conversation, but I want to, and I just feel obligated, given sort of a platform that I have right now, to kind of highlight and excavate an important part of, frankly, colonized history. About how the resistance against Joe Arpaio actually began as an indigenous rights-led fight at the Tonatiuh Embassy of Indigenous Peoples, and at a time when Arpaio enjoyed 85% approval rating in Maricopa County, and you didn't have a single person that had the courage to step up. It was actually, and this is, some of this history gets obscured even to this day, but I do think it's important to recognize, because so much of that fight in Arizona against Arpaio first and then against SB 1070 became foundational for the Sanctuary City movement, for DACA to win. And I think more people should know about its origins as an indigenous rights struggle, even as, again, I think we should challenge ourselves to have more discussion about that in spaces like these. And so now I'll cut myself off, Ahilan, and hand it back to you.
When I said last but not be the least, we weren't kidding, huh? We need like 1 more hour for this discussion. Thank you all so much. It was incredibly rich. Thank you, Chris, for guiding everyone through it, and really think that was absolutely spectacular. I really am sad. I feel like then, and just even reading the comments and things that have come from people, there's so many people in different spots in the advocacy world who have been listening to this conversation, I think greatly enriched by the discussion that you all have had. I don't have any grand closing remarks for the conference as a whole, just to say thanks to everyone once again for making it possible, for putting it on. We've had a really incredible set of rich discussions. We will both find a way to put the questions that were unanswered on Twitter, because it does seem like there's been a lot of engagement on that, which is fantastic. We're also going to put the recordings for all of the panels on our website, and we'll tweet those out. And then, as I said in the morning, we're going to email folks about, just things about what might be done differently, and how we can continue to experiment with the forum. But thank you all of you, really the 4 of you, for absolutely fantastic discussion. It gave me so much to think about, and I'm sure that's true of many of the 100 people who were watching and chiming in with their various thoughts at different points in time. And I'll pass it now to Hiroshi for his final thoughts.
I also don't have any thing really profound to say. Just really heartfelt gratitude for everyone who's participated in this conference. One takeaway from this conference and from this last panel is the need to have a conference on the 100 days about every 100 days. But that's just the way of saying that, this is a journey we're going to continue, right? I mean, I'm so grateful to moderators, speakers, a great conference organizing team, School of Law, UCLA. Ahilan and I've been talking, maybe conspiring for over a decade about starting the center and getting these conversations going. And so I'm heartened by the fact that this is not just the culmination of a decade of conspiracy, but it's also the beginning. So thank you. It's been really great.